All right, what is up, everybody? Welcome back to another day of SaberSim's DFS Office Hours. It is Wednesday, November 24th of 2021. It is Thanksgiving Day Eve here, which is always an exciting day in DFS. We have two huge slates for both basketball and hockey tonight, which is pretty exciting. And then, of course, the three-game NFL DFS slate for tomorrow for Thanksgiving, along with three independent showdown slates. If that is your thing, it will certainly be mine here for tomorrow. Hope you enjoyed the live stream yesterday with Chris and Max, the Ask Me Anything of sorts about Max's NBA DFS process. I was unfortunately knocked out sick most of yesterday. Wasn't really feeling well. Didn't have a chance to watch that live. Haven't had a chance to see it yet. So planning on watching that myself this afternoon, and then, of course, getting that recording up and time-stamped and written for you guys for this afternoon, so you can catch that recording if you haven't had a chance to see it yet. But we'll go ahead and just jump in here today. I actually don't have any questions in front of my queue here today. Wasn't entirely sure how busy this week was going to be with the streams. I know that a lot of folks have some time off, but of course, hopefully you're also getting a chance to spend some time with family. So maybe not so much of a time to be tuning into DFS live streams, maybe just sneaking away and listening to your DFS strategy videos when you have time. Not so sure. But anyway, what we'll do here, I will leave it open here for some time for people to ask questions if they have any. So if you have questions, I'll go ahead and let people know too as more people start to join the stream. If you have questions, pop them into the queue, pop them into the chat, pop them into the Office Hours channel and Slack, and we'll jump right into the questions that come up. For now, I'm going to go back to a question I had on Monday, came in on Monday asking about Thanksgiving slate strategy, because I wanted to spend a little bit more time even just kind of doing like a practice run through of what my potential approach might be for the Thanksgiving Day slate, since I didn't really feel like I was able to give that question too much justice back on Monday before projections were really updating, before we had a lot of news, and also while I wasn't feeling so well. So I'm going to start there. I'm going to go ahead and pull up the app, and we'll start talking about this here. And again, all I'm going to do, or what my goal for this is going to be, at least, I'm going to delete some of these old builds here, is I'm going to kind of just talk about what I'm thinking right now for the Thanksgiving Day slate, at least what my thought process is. Definitely don't want to like come across as like touting anything, but just kind of wanted to give you guys some ideas of how I'm thinking about the slate, how I'm starting to put together where I think some of the edge is, and then also what I'm really planning on looking at as we move forward. I am going to do this just for the three-game main slate. I'm not going to do this for each individual showdown. On Monday, when I answered this question originally, the very first thing I said is to just be a little cautious with your bankroll, right? On a three-game slate with the three showdowns, it's very easy to get a ton of action down very quickly, to all of a sudden be playing 15, 20% of your bankroll. And I'd really be careful doing that. Especially, if you want to have a little bit of fun on a holiday and play a little bit extra, that's totally fine. I will probably do something like that. But if your goal here is pure profitability, or if you've got like a legitimate risk of ruin here at stake or something like that, I would be very cautious going in and playing like 20, 25, 15% even of a bankroll on three games and different slates that are all correlated with one another. So I think the wisest, the most plus EV thing you can do with your bankroll for the slate tomorrow is to make sure you're not playing anything more than 5% or so of your bankroll across all three showdowns, the main slate, whatever you're choosing to play, because it's going to be very high variance with just three football games, and the results of these games are all going to be correlated with one another. So, but anyway, I'll talk about kind of how I'm thinking about this here and what I'm looking at. Obviously, the most important thing is going to be the injury news. Tomorrow, that's going to be huge for tomorrow. We will fortunately get the most important news early here. And I do believe we actually already have most of this. So Fields is now now doubtful. So pretty confident that Dalton's starting. I believe it is actually, we're also fairly confident that we're getting Tim Boyle instead of Jared Goff, but we've got Goff still projected as in here at the moment and showing as questionable. So important to keep an eye on that. Other big injury news, I think will be, is Kamara out? Kamara, it looks like questionable, maybe on the wrong side of questionable since we're projecting him for 0 right now. That's the last game of the night. That one has pretty big implications here. And I think that is probably about it for the significant news in terms of questionables here. It looks like questionable tags on a few other players here, but those are the ones that I'm keeping an eye on. So definitely a big day to keep an eye on the news as the day goes on, and also to make sure that you are late swapping in between these games. There will be an inactives report that comes out after each individual game, and the final sim will run for each game an hour before kickoff. So my strategy tomorrow will basically be almost to just blindly be swapping after every single game. I will set lineups for the lock that include my players for the first game that are playing in that, but then we'll almost certainly be rebuilding no matter what when the new sim runs to affect the inactives of this game, and then finally the last game of the slate. So going to be an important day to late swap. But in terms of kind of thinking about where we are getting an edge, I think there's a few things that we can do there. But my favorite thing, as always, is to do a research build to start this off. So what I like to do when I do a research build here, and I think why this can be very valuable, I've mentioned this a few times recently here, is that it's going to be a very high variance slate. Our sim variance is going to be at 10 with our default sliders for most of these contests anyway. So having an opportunity here to just see what different slate simulations can look like, how often players are showing up in the optimal lineup versus their ownership projection can give us an idea of where the ownership edge is on the slate. So I'm going to basically just do this here, run 1,500 lineups with 0, 0, 10 sliders. So when sim variance is at 10, right, we're using single game simulations to determine the projections for each player when we build each lineup. So we're going to essentially simulate the slate 1,500 times. And we'll see what we get out of this. And this is how I start to get an idea of where I think ownership might be efficient, where it might be inefficient on the slate. And we'll see what comes out of this. I've already done a little bit of a practice of this morning, so I have some idea of what we might see here, but I don't know if projections have updated, so we'll give this a second to build. But in the meantime, Jack said, does SaberSim have a video covering that? Said this just a minute ago. I'm not sure. Jack, let me know what you were referring to here. If we have a video. If it was about late swap, we certainly do. There are a lot of different late swap videos, 5-minute tutorials of how to late swap and hour-long videos of overall late swap strategy. So let me know what you're specifically looking for there and get you in the right direction there. But cool. And I'm actually going to pull this up on stream as well so people know. We'll say this is the Thanksgiving Day slate preview. Ask questions in chat. I'm going to pull this up on stream too. So we just have this up here. I do see we have quite a few more viewers here joining now. So welcome everybody. This is DFS Office Hours. I had no questions in my queue here at the start of the stream today. So what we're doing right now is I'm doing just a very short preview of how I'm thinking about the slate, how I'm approaching the slate overall at the moment, or just a general strategy of what I'm thinking, how I'm using SaberSim to kind of think about strategy at this particular point. We'll do this for a bit. I'll talk about this for a little bit. If you have questions, pop them into chat. Otherwise, we'll go ahead and cut things off a little earlier today. What I like to do here then is compare the exposure of certain players to the ownership. In other words, basically the leverage column, and figure out some spots where I want to push an edge, right? So I'll actually first typically go look at the players that I think are going over-owned. So basically players that are showing up in much less, in less lineups than they're showing up in optimal lineups less than they are expected to be owned. And what I'm generally seeing here pretty consistently, and this is pretty similar to what I was seeing earlier this morning, is that it's mostly Raiders. And if we look at the ownership, especially at like the quarterbacks, at least the way we're projecting it right now, we actually have an interesting situation where Derek Carr is coming in as our highest overall projected owned quarterback. I think this is a little bit off. I don't know if I agree. I don't know if I'm buying the idea that Carr is going to be the most owned quarterback. But I do think when you think about the salary savings you're getting with him, I'm thinking basically salary adjusted. What I actually do think is going to be likely is I think people are going to equate the Bills, Cowboys, and Raiders offenses from a salary adjusted standpoint. Basically saying that, like, well, I don't think if you look at Vegas or even the SaberSim totals, I don't think anybody necessarily is thinking that those teams have the exact same upside necessarily. I do think their ownership is going to come in pretty similarly because you're getting these salary savings on pretty much all of the Raiders players, right? Another way that I like to look at this is I like to enable this value column here and get an idea of what are the best point per dollar plays on the slate, right? What are the plays that traditional optimizers are going to get people to very easily? And we see Derek Carr coming in as the highest value play on the slate at the moment. And our research build is telling us here that that's inefficient. And that ownership is likely to be inefficient on some of these Raiders players. So I do think a Raiders fade overall is probably one of my more favorite stands at the moment. And that's just purely driven by my research build process here, right? So there are other things that you could get out of this year. I've talked about this in other videos. I think there are opportunities to look at players. I think it's interesting here. Again, not sure if I'm buying Josh Allen being just 25% owned, but I do think it is a bit interesting that we have essentially positive leverage value on the highest team total or one of the best projected offenses on the slate. The highest projected owned running back overall, I believe. Okay, actually, no. A top overall projected running back, one of the top overall projected running backs here on the slate from an ownership standpoint is a player that we're expected to get positive leverage on as well, which is Swift. I think is interesting, but I do think just saying, under on the Raiders is an interesting conclusion to gain here from the overall research build. From there, what I would most likely be doing here is going in and building some lineups and seeing what we start getting out of a test build. I do see some questions coming in live here, so we'll go ahead. I'll start to wrap this up a little bit here, and we'll start to tackle the questions that are coming in live here. But on the test build, we'll go ahead and use generally default settings. I'm going to basically pretend that I'm building lineups for, we'll say like the quarter jukebox, the $1 and the $3 20 maxes tomorrow, which are all 20 max contests, over 50K entrants, 60 lineups. I like this as kind of a nice little baseline. One thing to note here, correlation off, sim variance 10. The reason correlation is off, the reason we can be safe with correlation off is because the natural correlation of certain players is going to come through when we're just using single game simulations to build each lineup. Right. So if you roll a game sim where Andy Dalton throws 4 touchdowns, somebody's got to catch those touchdowns. It's likely you've got other Bears showing up in the lineup. Right. So you've got that natural correlation showing up in the game sims. Very high ownership fade. You're never going to see ownership fade this high on any other classic slate for NFL. So very aggressive stances with ownership fade. And we'll go ahead and build this and see what we get. And one thing you'll probably see right off the bat is that the ownership fade slider alone is going to do quite a few things that we already wanted it to based on our research build here, right? Because the research build has kind of identified the Raiders are likely to be overowned, we're going to see here in just a moment that we're probably going to be fading a lot of those plays already. So we'll see what we're getting here. A lot of what I will do at this stage is think more about managing my risk on certain players. So let's take a look at this here, and we can take a look and see who right off the bat are our most negatively leveraged plays on the slate. It's Jacobs, it's Carr, it's Waller, a couple other guys. Ingram's an interesting fade here, actually. Renfro shows up here, so we're getting a lot of that anyway. I like to look at then who are the plays that we're most over on. Again, this kind of checks with our assumptions here. We saw DeAndre Swift and Josh Allen showing up in the research build as positive leverage plays. Deshaun Jackson is an interesting play here as kind of a direct right? Negative going to likely be negatively correlated to a lot of the other plays that we're fading at least a little bit. So an interesting play there. The main other thing I want to do here, and you'll see this is probably going to be true of any lineups that you're building for tomorrow, especially if you're using default settings, is you're going to see a lot of plays like this showing up in your lineups, right? These are going to be very high upside plays at very low ownership, sub 5%, probably sub 3% in the most case. And I would say you're likely to get 1 or 2 of these guys showing up in almost any single lineup you build on default settings. And I think this is really sharp. I think this is an optimal strategy. These are plays that are going to have some kind of raw upside potential, have some set of game sims where they have that one or two big plays that you need to kind of break the slate really at their salary and are going to be spectacularly low owned. When ownership fade is as high as it is, a player that has that kind of ceiling upside game, even at a very low overall average projection, is going to pop. They're going to show up in a lot. They're going to show up in a lot of lineups. The main thing I like to do here is to make sure that one of these guys is not just dominating one of these guys is not just dominating my lineups more than the other. When I ran this earlier today, the guy that was actually showing up was Matt Breida. And I was getting a ton of Matt Breida, like almost 40% of Matt Breida. It now looks like it's come back down. But I like to do a little bit of risk management here and make sure that one of these guys is not just going to completely blow up my lineups, right? Not going to show up in a ton. So this actually looks pretty good. I'm not too worried about this, but I may take some of these players down a bit. Mostly these guys at the very low projected ownership and making sure that I'm not getting too much of them. And it actually here in this case looks pretty good. When I did a test build earlier today, I had to do this with a lot more players. But I'm generally making sure that for, these basically these dart throw type plays that I'm not taking on more than 10 to 20% potentially based on how owned I think they could be. And that's kind of right where we are in line overall here. I may take a look overall at my QBs as well. And on a 3-game slate like this as well, a thing I might be interested in doing here is just making a full fade of the Raiders offense. Because that was kind of the biggest stand that I saw showing up in my research build overall anyway. So that's kind of an introduction to how I would start approaching this, right? I think on the slate, like the Thanksgiving Day slate here, one of the most important things to do, I think there's a couple things. I think one is to kind of find an edge that you want to push. The way I often find that edge is by running this research build and looking for an ownership inefficiency, which again, at the moment, still plenty of time for things to change, seems to be the Raiders offense, who does not have the same kind of raw upside as some of the other offenses on the slate, but because of pricing feels like they're going to be pretty popular. That doesn't have to be your edge, right? Maybe your edge is that one of probably the worst overall defense on this slate is probably the Lions defense. And maybe you want to attack that by playing some more Bears, right? Maybe that's your particular edge, but find an edge that you want to push for one way or the other that you're going to kind of exploit in your lineups. I would say to manage your risk in particular on plays that are going to show up as very low owned kind of dart throw type plays, but also to still embrace those plays showing up in your lineups, right? What differentiates this lineup and a lot of what gives this lineup the upside you need to take down a GPP is not the Josh Allen with Diggs and Cole Beasley QB +2 stack that's going to be extremely highly owned, right? It's probably a lot of times these lower owned dart throws that give you a ton of edge on the field when they land. Right. And if they land, it doesn't even, landing in this particular case could be Jimmy Graham catching a touchdown, right? Like a 5-yard touchdown pass, right? That might be enough for this to land at his ownership and salary, right? Same thing with Deshaun Jackson. Anybody that's watched football in the last 10 years knows what Deshaun Jackson's win condition in an NFL DFS lineup is, right? But he really just needs one catch, right? So manage your risk. I wouldn't be comfortable with 80% Deshaun Jackson, but I'm certainly comfortable with 20% Deshaun Jackson, right? Similar for guys like Zay Jones, Josh Reynolds, these kinds of guys. If you were taking a different approach to the slate overall and you were taking a more significant stand on some of the highest projected owned plays, right? Like if you were taking a stand against the Stephon Diggs, the Josh Allens, the Dak Prescotts, the David Montgomerys, the DeAndre Swifts, you would probably need less by way of these super low-owned dart plays to make the rest of the lineup succeed, right? It just so happens that I think my approach at the way I kind of handled this particular build was actually to be over on some of the more chalky plays, right? I am over on Stephon Diggs. I am over on DeAndre Swift. I'm over on Josh Allen, the plays that are already likely to be very chalky, right? So a way that I can use these lineups to get a little bit different is by including these big dart throw type plays. But if you were building a lot of stacks built of guys that were, like Andy Dalton to Darnell Mooney type lineup constructions. You're not going to need so many of those types of dart throws showing up in your lineups. But anyway, nobody asked for me to come on here and talk about my Thanksgiving Day slate strategy. I was just doing this to get the show started, let some questions come in. And I do see some questions have now come in. So we will go ahead and start to answer some questions that you guys are actually interested in hearing about and hearing me talk about. So Cody said, hope you're feeling better. I am indeed feeling much better. Thank you for the wishes there. Let's go ahead and jump into these. So Matt says, is it possible to set a rule that a player is only rostered in the flex/utility spot? Like Jokic last night, I only wanted to be in the flex. There isn't, unfortunately, a rule to do that, to say only roster in the flex position. The builder automatically will prioritize the player playing in the latest game. And then if there are tiebreakers, the highest salary player into your flex positions, and also order those based on the flexibility of the flex spot, right? So like in NBA on DK, for example, you have the one pure utility spot, but you also have two other kind of flexes with the guards and the forward positions. So we will always prioritize players to here, let me go ahead and get in here real quick. Reset this too. I was doing some testing earlier this morning here, but we will always prioritize players playing in the latest games possible here into those flex positions, right? So highest salary players playing in the latest games into the flex spots. So by default, you should have had quite a bit of flexibility for late swapping last night. Now, when you take a player who is the second highest salary player on the slate and at lock the highest overall projected player on the slate, I think he was, and remove him from a 4-game slate halfway after the slate has started, right? When there's only 2 games left of flexibility anyway, sometimes it can be difficult to make that swap, right? I'm sure pretty much anybody that late swapped last night with SaberSim probably saw the message saying that you need to relax some of your build rules or remove some of your build rules to finish late swapping your lineups. I did too, right? That's kind of just the natural side effect of having the second highest salary and the highest overall projected player on the slate get ruled out after lock on a 4-game slate. But we will build your lineups as best we can at lock to make them as flexible as possible here by prioritizing those late players and high salary players into your flex positions. So Lundar asks a really good question. How many games back does SaberSim look at when it's running sims, like heavier on recent games? He said, I asked because Vegas is really feeling the Ruggs loss, which is still fairly recent and would affect projections if recent games are weighted more. They are. It's a very complicated algorithm for how that's done. Will has actually put a ton of work in overall into improving that and making that better. What it's actually called is it's called basically a decay rate. Basically, how much does old information decay in terms of how valuable that is to our model over time? So the short answer is that yes, we prioritize more recent information more in our simulations, but going beyond that gets a little bit too technical for me pretty quickly. It changes a little bit based on the sport and the team, I think. But yes, it does take into account more recent information more. And that's true on like a seasonal level, right? More recent games and weeks are valued more. But even as you jump into past seasons, which also do have an impact on the model, though much less so because of that decay rate, right? It is also taken into account there. So. All right, cool. Let's see. Matt, are you by chance also Go Bears They Suck in the Slack channel? Very similar question overall here from somebody named Go Bears They Suck in Slack. He said, I have a question about setting rules. Last night, I couldn't figure out how to put Jokic in only the utility spot. Is that possible? So I just kind of covered that. Again, it isn't very possible with a strict rule, right? We do prioritize those players going into the flex positions. We prioritize players playing in the latest games possible into the flex positions, right? So Jokic was given his salary and positional eligibility, probably already very likely only used in your flex positions, unless you were also playing Zubac, or there weren't really a lot of viable centers playing in these late games. Nurkic, I guess, unless you were actually, even if you were playing Nurkic, it would prioritize Jokic in the flex position, right? So Jokic would have been prioritized there. If you want to force that, if you want to be very aggressive and kind of force that usage of Jokic into the flex position, one way you could get away with doing that here is running a build and eliminating Jokic from showing up in other positions. So eliminate lineups where Jokic shows up in your flex, in your center position, right? And what that would look like is going in here, and first let's edit a projection here. So we can see, okay, so actually, I mean, this isn't very helpful because he's marked out. All right, let's try this again here. I can't project him in because he's actually legitimately marked out. Let's say, for example, Luka would be a good example because Luka's playing in the last game and he was actually in. So let's say we're back at lock, and in an alternate reality, we had Jokic news before lock, but Luka was kind of that player that everything hinged on, right? And Luka has point guard and small forward eligibility. So one thing you could do here is basically go in and make sure that if you're going to use Luka and you're going to roster him in a lineup at lock, he needs to be showing up in the flex position, or at least a flexible position, right? He needs to show up in either the guard, the forward, or the utility spot, right? Rather than just showing up in the point guard spot where he's not as flexible. And you can kind of see that's already happening, right? So he shows up in one utility spot. He shows up in the forward utility spot here 4 times, and he shows up in the guard utility spot not at all. And then at our really inflexible positions, right, he's really just showing up 1 time in that small forward position, right? So you can kind of see the impact of this, that this is already happening. If you wanted to nail this down a little bit more, right, I think you could go ahead and just say, eliminate this one lineup where he's showing up as only a small forward, so that should I have to swap and get off of the Luka news, at the very least, I know that I can do so in a way that gives me other flexibility in terms of what player gets subbed in. And I think that's fine, especially on a 4-game slate. I would say this is probably overkill for like a 13-game slate like tonight, even if you're going in. And who's questionable tonight is there's not really, it actually seems like the news is pretty clear on tonight's slate, but even if we just assumed that somebody was, I think it would probably be overkill on a slate like tonight. But is Lillard questionable? No, it seems like he's off the injury report now. So anyway, you guys get the idea, right? I think it's probably overkill on bigger slates. I think it's fine on smaller slates to do something like that. But a lot of this is automated for you. So Pop said, hi, Jordan, single entry for tomorrow's slate. Touch the sliders or don't worry about ownership. Let's see what the sliders say. I would say the sliders are probably not going to tell you to ignore ownership. I think the sliders are probably going to tell you to be pretty aggressive with ownership, even in a single entry. It depends on what stakes you are playing, or not stakes. I guess in a way stakes. What size contest you're playing, but even for a single entry of 5,000 people or so, right? You're gonna have a pretty moderate ownership fade. I think using the sliders at the defaults are a good idea, and seeing what you get out of this, right? But ownership is going to be pretty important for a 3-game slate. I think it's actually crucially important. The thing I would caution you most about is avoid letting your biases get into your head about what the good plays are. Because on a single game where there's only 3 games overall here, right? We need to take some ownership shots. But if you caught the start of the stream here, you saw that when I ran a build for 20 max contests over 50K people, I was getting a lot more low-owned plays, like a lot more dart throw type plays showing up in my lineups than you would get for something like a single entry, 5,000 people or so, which again makes some sense. but there are still going to be some ownership stands made here, right? It seems like at the moment, by default, what SaberSim likes a lot to do tomorrow is fade the Raiders and fade Ingram in particular. Those two plays, and then kind of build lineups around that, right? So I mean, you still get some Raiders showing up selectively in lineups, but on the whole, to make those kinds of stands, right? So I would just kind of to answer this question, I think the default sliders are probably fine. I think they're going to put you in a good direction, but I would be very concerned with ownership tomorrow. I would make it a big part of the way you are thinking about the slate. And if you have a gut feeling that the ownership projections are a bit off, if something seems a little off to you, or you've done some research or watched some other videos, you think somebody's going to be higher or lower owned than we are projecting, make the change. It's totally fine. You guys are all capable of adding value and seeing that and making that gut call on slates where the ownership fade slider is higher by default, like it will be tomorrow. You are going to get even more value out of making those adjustments, right? So I think it's wise to do so. I'm already thinking about what that might look like for me, right? A lot of the way I approach slate tomorrow, the slate tomorrow is ultimately going to come down a lot of how people look at these three big offenses that are at the top, right? The Bills, Cowboys, and Raiders. I don't know if I mentioned this at the start of the stream as well. I don't know if I'm buying that the Raiders are going to be the chalkiest offense on the slate, or at least Carr is going to be the chalkiest quarterback on DraftKings. I'm not sure if I agree with that, but I do think the idea that the field might think of these three offenses as roughly the same is really interesting. So I may adjust these and maybe kind of end up equaling out a lot of these QBs. If that's what we get, I think it's a clear edge in fading the Raiders. I think a lot of the way I approach the slate is going to come down to how much I'm actually buying that happening, and what do I think the ownership's actually going to be, right? So I don't know. It's really interesting because I think like Josh Allen and Dak have disappointed recently, and that doesn't really matter much to me, but it's certainly going to matter to people that are a little bit more recency biased, maybe a little bit softer fields in general that you might get on the Thanksgiving Day slate. If we get a bunch of box score watchers setting lineups and this is the actual ownership we get, I know Carr has been a little bit hit or miss lately too, but if these are the actual ownerships we get, I don't know. I know what I'm going to want to do, but Richard said, is tomorrow's slate a good spot to lower max salary to maybe 49.9 to increase differentiation? I think at the biggest contests, it can make some sense, right? I would probably avoid going any lower than 49.9 just because I think you're going to quickly start eliminating good lineups without lowering your chance of being unique anymore. And it's something I would probably only do if you were playing the biggest contests, something where by default sim variance was 10, like at the very least, probably a 20 max. Yeah, probably a 20 max over 10,000 or 50,000 people. I think you can consider it. I think it's fine. I don't, there's a lot of data out there on showdown slates that defends the idea that lowering your max salary does lower your chance of being duplicated, especially just removing the 50K lineups from your pool. I don't know if there's been as much done on that for main slates. So I'm kind of going with my intuition here. And my intuition says that, yeah, it's definitely, especially if you're playing contests that are 100,000, 150,000 lineups in there, like you definitely expose yourself to being duplicated a bit if you're playing really chalky. So I think it's an interesting idea. But I probably wouldn't go below much lower than like 49.9, and probably only if I'm playing the biggest contest possible. Right. So when we kind of think about ownership, there's kind of two different things. There's two different things that we're thinking about. The first is avoiding duplication and making sure that we're building a unique lineup. And the second is getting relative edge on the field, because you jump more lineups, you fly up the standings a little bit higher when a lower owned player has a great game, right? And in different sports and different slates and contest types, those levers kind of move. Right, I've talked about this before, where I actually think the biggest advantage to playing low-owned players in showdown slates is avoiding duplication. The biggest advantage to avoiding ownership in main slates is never about duplication. It's about finding that relative edge. And I think on a 3-game slate like tomorrow, the biggest advantage you get is still more about giving your lineups a little bit more relative edge on the field than it is about avoiding dupes. But as you get to those bigger contests, those really big 100K lineups plus, I think you can start to think about that as something that maybe you want to focus on. But when we go back to this build I ran here earlier at the start, right? Like these lineups were using combinations of players that I think are getting us there anyway, right? If these are the actual ownerships of these two players, this lineup is incredibly unlikely to be duplicated just out of the sheer combination of these two players together, right? You can see like a lot of these lineups have at least one or two of these guys, and this was built for a 20 max over 50K, right? So like as the ownership fade slider gets as high as it does when you're building lineups for a contest of this type, you start to get the right combinations of players to avoid duplication anyway showing up here. So like, I'm not sure. And you even start to make salary sacrifices. Like some of this starts to happen automatically for you. You even start to make salary sacrifices because the lineups that are 50K, right, are the chalkier lineups. So like maybe this is a lineup that actually maybe should be eliminated here. I don't know. Maybe not. Still some low owned plays here, but you can kind of see the lineups that do get right up against the salary limit are the lineups that don't really have those low end plays in them anyway. So all this kind of happens a little bit automatically for you. But anyway, rambling now. So Ben said, I have a question about exposures. I just ran a crunch. I'm getting Connor McDavid 90%. The projected ownership is about 15%. How much leverage is optimal? Well, it ultimately depends on your risk tolerance. The biggest driving factor, the biggest factor that determines how much exposure you will have to a certain player is the sim variance slider. And the sim variance slider has been back tested, and we set it at what we feel is an optimal value for the contest size you say you're playing. So maybe you're playing something like the hip check, which I think is around here, right? And you run this. The biggest factor in determining, what players you're getting most exposure to will be that sim variance slider. That is, again, it's back tested to a certain value. So the short answer is that you can leave it alone, right? And kind of trust what you're getting out of this. The longer answer is it depends on your overall risk tolerance, right? For some players, you may say that you want that to be 100%, right? You want to be all in on your highest owned player, highest owned stack, whatever, and make sure that you have the greatest upside possible when that stack goes off. For a different player, 90% of, I think this build is stuck, 90% exposure to one skater in a high variance sport like hockey would be ridiculous, right? We can see here, hang on, I think my build got stuck here. Let me restart here. Give this a second to run. Cody said McDavid will be more owned than that. I would be shocked to see him under 25%. Yeah, I'm willing to buy that for sure. It seems like McDavid is one of those guys that is always consistently a little bit higher owned than we project here. But we'll give this a second to build. I'm curious what I get in this test build. When we did our NHL strategy session with Mr. Clean and Couch a couple weeks ago, one of the things that came up here is that one way to add value to the NHL process, or at least to smooth out your ROI variance in a sport that already plays very variantly, right, is to lower your exposures to players and to smooth out your overall exposures, especially when there's one player or one stack or one team that's popping in a lot of lineups. So I think it can be kind of a good approach. But you don't have to do that. And I think the most important thing setting the stage here is just remembering that you are getting a certain amount of players here. What's going on here? You are getting a certain amount of exposure to a player based on what we think is appropriate for the contest you tell us we're playing based on the sim variance slider. But in terms of what's an appropriate amount to lower him down to, what I like to do is I like to think about who are the players that I want to be over the field on. And if you've decided, yeah, I want to be over the field on McDavid and Edmonton stacks tonight, how much leverage do you need to kind of still be over the field and be comfortable with that, right? So maybe you want to be 2x over the field. That's a baseline that I like to use a lot. And how high could McDavid's ownership be? What are our expectations about how high McDavid's ownership could be? Well, I'll buy what Cody said here, and I'll actually say 30%, right? So if McDavid gets as high as 30% owned, how much exposure do I need to remain over the field enough to get an edge? Well, maybe it's 60%, right? Rather than 80%. And once that updates, there we go. Trim that down a little bit. And maybe we also come down on this guy too, right? And maybe we take that approach. But this is a risk management stance here. This is a diversification move. This is not necessarily, at least for this purpose, something we are doing in the name of making lineups that are higher expected value. This is purely, this is a move that we are doing to diversify more, to smooth out our variance more. So I think it's just a very important thing always to remember, and always good to think about, like, why are we doing these things, right? So, like, even going back to Ben's original question here of how much leverage is optimal. Well, the builder itself, SaberSim, is telling you, given the current projections, the current ownership projections, and the contest you are saying you are playing, how much leverage is optimal is 60% leverage on these players, right? But you may say, okay, that's great, that's fine, that's optimal from an EV standpoint, but I'm not comfortable having 80% of my lineups out of a pool of 20 having one skater whose most likely outcomes are far below his average, right? This is generally just true of most skaters on any given hockey game. So I'm going to diversify and lower my variance. You may lower your upside a little bit when this is the right stack, but you also smooth out your variance over the long run and make the swings of this sport play out a little bit smoother. So hopefully that's clear. But Matt said, what about setting rules for players on a team? Not that this is a great correlation, but what if I don't want Vassal in a Derek White lineup? Is this possible? It's not, unfortunately. We don't have those kinds of player groups available. There is the way you can do this. I'll show you there is kind of one way you can do this at the moment. So let's build. Do I have a build that I ran earlier for NBA? I guess not. So there's no way to set a rule like this beforehand. And the reason why, just so I'm clear on the reason why, this isn't just something that we're just not doing for fun. The reason why is because we believe that the correlation slider handles this in a more sophisticated way. And to be completely honest, that basketball correlations themselves are probably in general a little bit overrated. That players that are negatively correlated or believed to be negatively correlated with one another are frequently less negatively correlated than people think. Right? Or rather neutrally correlated across the entire spectrum of those game outcomes, right? You can see that kind of right here. But if you wanted to remove those kinds of players from your lineups, here's what I would do. I would we'll build 20 here. And what I would recommend doing is making use of the filters. So we can look here. Are we getting any Vassal? We are. So you can filter by certain players. And then, so we actually don't have any players. We don't have any lineups that use both of these two players together. Let's see if we do in the top 100. But you can use the filters tools. Let me do this first. And then remove lineups that have certain combinations of those two players together from your pool. So this might not be the perfect example. Oh, we do. So we have one lineup combined where both of these two players are showing up together. So we could just uncheck that and then fill. and fill back to 100, and we'll be all good there. Now, I know that can be a bit tedious because in reality, you may have different player groups, different whatever combinations of players that you want to remove, and it can be a lot to go through and do all at once. I know that's a bit of a pain. I will caution you really of one thing here, that these NBA correlations are very small. The value that you may be getting by combining groups of players that have small negative correlations to one another together in a lineup, but all of those players are extremely well priced or are very price efficient, or some or all of those players are very low owned or have high raw upside, is probably outweighing that, right? So, I mean, while Wagner and Wendell Carter on the Magic probably have a small negative correlation, right? Yeah, so they have a small negative correlation, right? They are both so price inefficient that we can play lineups where they are combined together. And there actually are two highest exposed players on the slate. There's probably a ton of lineups where these two guys come in together, and eliminating those lineups to maximize a very small correlative value between those two players and ignoring the fact that they are both extremely price efficient can be a little bit dangerous in terms of reducing the quality of your lineups. So be cautious with that kind of thing. But so anyway, Joseph said, you figure all pros use optimizers like SaberSim or another platform or a custom self-made optimizer. I love SaberSim and I'm getting more and more confident in using and dialing in. However, I'm still at a negative ROI. How are these pros / consistent winners utilizing optimizers differently that are getting them plus ROI? Is it more info, dial-in methods, etc.? A few things to note on this. First of all, I would say the very first thing that jumps off is ROI is very fickle, like an extremely fickle calculation that will, based on the pure variance of hitting a bink versus coming in second, can have a huge dramatic swing. I've actually broken down, like in a simulation of 100 slates, just how fickle that calculation can be, even with a very consistent player and a proven winning player. And I have a video up on our channel here. It's all the way down at the bottom here. Last playlist on our homepage here. Watch our office hours greatest hits. This video right at the front. What does variance look like after 100 slates for a winning player, right? This video will help you understand why ROI is kind of a dangerous thing to look at, right? In terms of determining if your process is successful. The better overall calculation you can look at is your top 1% equity. So if you look at a tool like Roto Tracker, is a good one. You can upload your past entries files for everything you've played pretty much on any of the major sites and see how often are you putting lineups in the top 1%, right? If you are putting more than 1% of your lineups in the top 1% of contests, it's likely that at some point that's going to pay off for you. It's likely that you are a long-term profitable player. But Cody here basically just nailed it, right? Took down the mini-max in NFL this past weekend and said his ROI before and last weekend are way different, even though my skill didn't change. And that's basically the problem, right? Like ROI is so dependent on having a huge bink day and doesn't really help you in terms of determining if you're a good player. But in terms of what are pros doing, what are the best players doing to add value, the reality is it's a lot of different things, right? There are a lot of different ways to add value. It's important to remember as well that SaberSim is automating a lot of the value-adding process that you would have to do yourself manually on a traditional tool, right? Like SaberSim is process for somebody using some traditional optimizer that only optimizes for average projection. The taking into account correlations and ownership and variance of individual players and teams and stacks and things like that when we build each lineup is something that you would have to kind of think critically about and then program a bunch of rules to kind of mimic on a traditional tool. And that's already happening for you. But what can you do more to add value even more so on SaberSim? It's difficult to answer that in a one-size-fits-all answer, and it's going to be difficult for each individual player. So, I mean, I've talked a little bit at length here for what I do, at least in particular for NFL and baseball, and I've recorded it. So again, on our YouTube channel, this NFL course here, basically the second thing you see here, the last video in this series is an hour-long video of me recording my NFL DFS process for how I like to add value to my football process. And I did the same thing a little bit lower for baseball. That is currently missing from this playlist, but as soon as I hop off, will not be, and I'll make sure I get it added in here. But I did the same thing. And like one thing that I've just found has kind of worked for me over time is this idea of running research builds to take a little bit of a closer look at ownership and find some ownership leverage opportunities. And I like to mess with, especially less so in basketball, right? But more so in sports where there's less late swap going on overall, right? Where things are less likely to change as far as the slate goes on. I like to do this thing where I run research builds. I figure out players that I think are going to be inefficiently owned, and I take stands on them. And sometimes I double down by taking additional stands on players they're negatively correlated to and things like that, right? All these things I talk about in this video and the baseball one. But Max was on here, or Max recorded a video about a week ago now, 5 days ago here, talking about his strategy for NBA, how he adds value to the SaberSim NBA process. And he has a very projection editing heavy focus towards editing his NBA lineups, right? He keeps a very close eye to the close eye on the news and makes adjustments to projections of players that maybe stand to have a better game because they're going to maybe play more minutes, but also maybe have a better matchup on the other side, or a variety of different things that he kind of details in this video, right? And Max's overall DFS process is very commonly focused on editing projections, whereas mine is very focused on editing exposures based on where I want leverage. So there's a lot to unpack there. I would say kind of like three big takeaways to this question. The first is to proceed with caution with using ROI as a measure of how good of a DFS player you are. Use your 1% equity instead. Much better, much more reliable calculation. Two, remember that what SaberSim automates for you would be process for, it would be like manual process for anybody using any other tool, right? And that's not to say to just get complacent and just say, well, maybe on a certain slate, it's fine to do this, but I wouldn't get complacent and just say, SaberSim has it all figured out, whatever. I'm not going to ever touch anything ever again. I'm going to close my eyes and press button and print money every single slate, right? There are slates where I have a process that looks a little bit more like that. There are slates where I add a little bit more manual work, right? But to remember how much is happening for you behind the scenes here. And then third, watch some of these other videos we have up on our YouTube channel. Watch Office Hours, ask questions in Slack, and try to figure out something that makes sense for you as a way to make it your unique process and to add a little bit value, right? It's ultimately, you're going to have to find something that resonates with you, the way that you see the game and what makes sense to you, because somebody else's process that they've worked to build is never actually going to work perfectly for you. Right. And that's true for anyone. That's true for any sport here. Is that you've got to find something. I watched Max's video. I thought it was fascinating. It was really interesting, but editing player projections in that way is never going to be something that really resonates with me because I don't have a gut instinct of what a player's projection is supposed to be. It just doesn't work that way for me. Some people do, right? But I have a very good gut instinct of what exposure makes sense for a certain player, especially when compared to the ownership. And especially after having done some of my own research. Like I can say, this is a guy that I want to be 2x the field on. This is a guy that I want to full fade. This is a guy that I want to match the field and not worry about it, right? I have that sense. And that's something that it's just the way my brain works, I guess. So kind of coming up with what that process is for you is an important part of the journey, really. So, but And I think kind of the last point I would make on this is, as you are developing that process, try to always come back to why you might be doing something. What is the purpose? What are you trying to gain out of that in terms of making your lineups better, right? Are you improving the correlation of your lineups? Are you making your lineups less owned, right? The sliders can be a very good tool for getting you there. These are characteristics of good lineups, right? That lineups are correlated and they approach ownership correctly and they take into account the natural variance of players, right? Are you making a adjustment that's going to lower your risk? Are you making a risk management adjustment, right? Coming back to those kinds of questions and saying, I'm doing, like, I could very quickly say to you that part of the purpose of my research build is to determine ownership inefficiencies in the market that is a slate of DFS, right? And while the ownership fade slider does take that into account, right, at some base level, this approach, what I'm trying to do is trying to expand on that and add additional value to the ownership side of the lineup building process, right? So, but if you can't, if you told me you were doing something and you were saying, oh, I do that to improve my ROI, right? I would probably challenge you to think a little bit deeper about that and think, what are you doing to the lineups to improve your ROI? And if you can't answer the question, then maybe it's something that should just be stripped out from the process, especially if it's a time-consuming thing, right? I hear sometimes from people that say like, oh, I'm doing this and I'm checking this and I'm doing this and my whole NFL process takes 2 hours. And then when we look and break down the actual process, it's like, we don't even know why we're doing all of this stuff, right? So anyway, I'm rambling here. Some awesome conversation going on in Slack here as well, or not Slack, in YouTube chat about this. Johnny said a lot of these pros have a repeatable process. That is a very important point here as well, and rarely deviate from that process, but that does not mean they win every day, but it allows the process to win on the nights they hit. That is also an important point, is I would be cautious changing up over and over and over and over and over again. Give yourself a little bit of time to at least study a process and see your results before changing it again. So he also said something that would help be studying 150 lineups from pro players. Look at how much they own players. What were their exposures? Why? I think this can also be valuable, right? It is at least very much a better alternative than studying the winning lineups. I think one of the worst things you can do if you're trying to get better at DFS is look at the winning lineup every single night and try to learn something from it. Bad lineups are going to win often. And you often can't learn anything from the single lineup that happens to win. But studying players that you know are good can be very helpful. The one thing I would caution you on here is that it is very easy, especially for the human brain, to kind of imply or write in a repeatable process, or to basically find a pattern in noise, right? You may go study Giant Squid's NFL lineups from last week and say, oh, he has 9 quarterbacks. And the week before he had 9 quarterbacks. And the week after he had 10 quarterbacks, and say, oh, okay, winning players use 9 to 10 quarterbacks. And that may just be noise, right? That may not be a repeatable pattern. And even if it was, the reason for that may not be because 9 to 10 quarterbacks is like an optimal number of quarterbacks to use. It may be pure chance, or it may be some other reasoning kind of behind why that showed up, right? So I would be a little bit cautious there, because it's easy to write a pattern in where it doesn't exist. So this is another good point too, right? It's also very easy to get frustrated seeing winners celebrating every night, right? But even within the SaberSim community, there's a lot of losers every night. There's a couple winners, more losers than winners. But those wins make up for a lot of those losses here overall. But Wade says, can you talk a little bit about building based on the different percentiles, say 95th versus average? Yeah, so the way these percentiles work, we removed the ability to set these percentiles pre-build because they were interfering with the sim variance slider. So what you have here now in step 3 is the ability to change this percentile, which will take the pool of lineups that has already been built for the given contest that you're playing and resort this based on, if we change it to the 85th percentile, we are changing that player's mean to the points they score. One thing to be very careful of here is if you change any custom projections here. So let me do this real quick. If you edit any custom projections here, they won't update correctly when you change the percentile. So I see some conversation about dark mode in the chat. I'm down to go to dark mode here. I was streaming only in dark mode for a while, and then somebody told me it was hard to see, and they preferred when I streamed in the light theme. So I switched, but we can go back to dark mode. That's fine with me. Anyway, what's happening here is you are updating the lineups to use the projection that player scores in 15% or less of the game sims, right? As that player's new projection, and then resorting the lineups. The ultimate effect you get out of this is you slightly increase the upside of a lineup, I would say. And you actually, let me put it this way, because you're not rebuilding lineups, you're resorting them. You are using lineups that probably have slightly more raw upside at the expense of their average performance. In a sport like basketball, you're not going to see a huge impact overall by using different percentiles on the exposures and the lineups you're getting, because players' projections are fairly normally distributed, and a player's 85th percentile performance can probably be pretty easily predicted from their average outcome, right? But in a higher variance sport, when you change your percentile, you're going to see quite a bit more. You'll see probably some more diversity in your lineups. You'll probably see a little bit more lower ownership. You'll see overall a little bit higher upside at the expense of that average performance. This isn't something I use very often. The main reason I ever like to use this is to just kind of get a sense of what I am more or less asking of a lineup for a particular contest that I'm playing. And then I can kind of, check with my intuition if that's realistic or possible, I think, for the lineup. I know Mr. Clean, when he was on here talking NHL 2 weeks ago or so, said that he pretty much always just sets this to 95th, and builds lineups from there. In a high variance sport like hockey, the impact of that is it kind of automatically starts to smooth out your exposures a little bit. You get exposure to players and actually you get exposure to stacks that are a little bit more diverse. You get some lower owned stacks showing up in your lineups. I know Matt has mentioned that he likes to use this for NBA a bit here as well. It's not something that I use very often, but I think at the very least it can just be interesting, right? It can be an interesting way. That's the best way I've always found to use it, is to kind of just check with your assumptions of what is possible for a player, right? Or for a lineup. For a 13-game slate tonight, if we imagine the idea of a winning score being 375 might be about reasonable, right? If we are going to roster, I don't know, what's a good example of this? If we are going to roster a guy like Nasir Little in 30% of our lineups, right, we are essentially asking 37 points of him to put a lineup in the top 1% in a huge contest, right? This is probably the winning score of a big contest, like the big GPP, maybe, and maybe even a little bit too high for that, right? If you have kind of a sense of intuition about if that is a little bit too high or too low for that player, right, that can help guide you in determining how you want to use that player. That, again, coming from somebody that doesn't really have a sense, that doesn't really think about DFS in this way, that feels a little bit high to me for a 95th percentile projection for him. And that might be a guy that I want to, even if I'm going to use him, maybe come in a little bit closer to the field on in my lineups, right? That is how I like to use this when I've used this in the past. is to set the percentile to something where you are getting projected scores that resemble what feel like you would need to bank that particular contest, and then combine that with your overall intuition here about who to roster. That transitions really well into this next question here from Joshua. He said, when is a good time to start adjusting? Okay, well, maybe not so much, but when is it a good time to start adjusting exposure or projections in step one? Is it on a hunch, or are there some actual things to look for that would help? Then he said, I'm scared to make adjustments because I assume SaberSim has it more right than myself. So I would say if you are scared to make adjustments, right, but want to, the best advice I can give you is to make your adjustments in step three, because you are going to leave things generally alone. You're going to take the system of the projections and ownerships from the sims, build a pool of lineups that we feel are viable for the contest, right? A big pool of 500 to 1,500 lineups for the contest here. And then you have this kind of, I like to think about it as a playground of viability that you can kind of land anywhere on your actual 20 lineups you use to roster, knowing that all of these lineups were built with those same inputs, right? So if you are kind of scared to make adjustments because you don't want to mess with things, do it on step three, which is where you can kind of feel comfortable making those adjustments, right? And you can even kind of check against SaberSim here, right? Like, what if, let's just say you were all in on Giannis, right? You can kind of ask, you can almost ask SaberSim, is that viable, right? Like, can I play 100% Giannis lineups playing 20 and lineups out of the pool, right? Can I play 100% Harden and Giannis stacks together? Well, in this case, SaberSim is going to say, no, not within the first 500 lineups that we think are viable for this contest, right? Now SaberSim is telling you basically back off a little bit, right? Now, you could rebuild more lineups and you could lock these players in step one, but you'd be making an adjustment to kind of the system at that point, right? So now you're getting kind of a warning to back off. But if we could lock Giannis, right? We probably could lock just Harden as well, right? Maybe not. Let's see. Will it work? Yeah, we could, right? So you can do this. I guess the point here, right, is if you're unsure of what changes to make, or you're unsure of how to add value, or you're worried that your kind of, I don't know, intuition or sense or research isn't accurate, do more in step three, focus more on step three, because you are working within a system of lineups that we already think is viable for the contest. So in terms of determining, if your adjustments are sharp in general, I would veer away from hunches and more from like research where there is some data behind it, whether that's somebody sharp in the industry that you follow, it could be that person's picks, right? But find something that's backed up with data is the best advice I can give, right? The number one tool I use to make adjustments is my research build that I feel like is a somewhat data-driven approach, right? I'm comparing a percent chance of a player being in the optimal lineup to their ownership and making an adjustment from there, right? And that is it perfect? No, but it's data-driven and I believe in it, right? Less so on a hunch. Now, I don't think there's anything wrong with making a gut call or kind of acting on your gut here in step three, right? Because at this point, your gut is just helping you sort through these lineups, right? And that gut call may present in different ways, right? In one sense, 95th percentile for Nasir Little looked a little bit high to me, so I brought his exposure down. Maybe you are locking Giannis, right? Maybe that's your gut, right? It's fine. So in step three, it's very difficult to go wrong here, to be completely honest. So okay. Cool. Andrew has a question here. Let me find it. Oh, yeah. Okay. So this was a question here from Andrew, and he said, does SaberSim account for individual defensive player performance, or does it view defense as a whole? I covered that and mentioned that that we view the defense as a whole. And then he said, following up on this, the reason I asked was because the Steelers were missing Watt, Hayden, and Fitzpatrick, and wanted to see if this was being accounted for in SaberSim. Sounds like it wasn't. Best tips for manual adjustments in a scenario like this. So, okay, this is kind of a complicated question. Because while we're not going to necessarily pick up the individual defensive players that are on the field, right? We'll have a sense overall of the way that a team is expected to perform. And the very first thing I would do is to see if we are predicting a different results than other models, in particular something like Vegas, right? Like, let's just say, for example, that, I don't know, let's say Denver's banged up and has 4 missing players on defense, right? If we have the Chargers projected at 26 and Vegas has them at an implied total of 28.5, right? To me, that might be an indication that at the very basic, one thing that might be very easy to do is to bump them up, right? Like, this might be an indication that we're missing something about the way this game state is because of the injuries to Denver, and it's a good opportunity to bump them up. And I think this is, in terms of how, from the practical standpoint, what's the easiest way to do this? I think this is probably the easiest way to do it. But if we were already projecting the Chargers in line with the way that Vegas is also projecting, I would probably caution against doing that or going too overboard with doing that, because we're probably already, even if in the simulations we're not necessarily taking into account the individual defensive players on the field, right? While simulating the games, we're essentially like getting to the same conclusion. And I think you could have the impact of double counting that incorrectly there by adding that back in. So I know that's like a little bit of a confusing idea here. But I would say the best advice I could give is first check and see how we are modeling the game and the teams against Vegas in particular. And if there's a discrepancy there, then I would bump the team who stands to gain because of the defense being hurt on the other side. Is probably the best way to proceed there. But so yeah. I'm trying to think if there's any other better way to explain that or any way to add more information there. But kind of the core idea is even if the individual defensive players are not represented on the football field in the game simulations, because of other inputs to the model, we will have a sense of how many points a team is expected to score or how many yards they're expected to gain. So, and I do still owe you also, Andrew, a more clear answer or one more clarifying answer of this defensive question in the first point, because I'm pretty sure that is true for defense, but there may be some nuance there that I'm missing. So I will ask Matt and Will and make sure I understand that correctly and follow up as well. And I know I promised you I would do that on Monday, and then I got sick. So, but anyway, it is 1:15 here, my time. So I am going to call it right there for today's stream. Thank you to everybody that tuned in here to the stream today, asked questions, watched my little Thanksgiving Day preview as well. We will be off tomorrow. So I hope you all have a wonderful Thanksgiving and enjoy some time watching football with your families. We'll be back again on Friday. I'm fairly confident. But I will let you know, it is possible that Friday stream ends up instead kind of being ask your questions in the Office Hours channel, but pretty confident we'll be streaming on Friday here. I will double check that. But hopefully, otherwise, we'll talk to you guys all next week. Enjoy the Thanksgiving Day slate tomorrow. Have a great holiday, and I will talk to you guys all soon. See ya.